What are we hearing, or who are we hearing might be a replacement as the OC in Atlanta?
How about this, David? Since the time that you left that part of the set to sit down with us here, we have news that's been confirmed by Adam Schefter that Steve Sarkisian, who was just tabbed to replace Lane Kiffin as the Alabama offensive coordinator. His stay is a brief one down in Tuscaloosa, as he is now poised to become the new Falcons offensive coordinator. A major curveball. No one saw this coming because, to this point, the only other name we had kind of zoned in on was Chip Kelly. But Steve Sarkisian, formerly, of course, the Washington and USC head coach, and very briefly, the Alabama offensive coordinator.
I'm just scrambling in my brain here. Any connections between Sarkisian and the Falcons?
This is as far the only thing I can think of is when Sarkisian was out of work, he did spend a little bit of time with the Falcons at their training camp, but there's not an obvious connection here. Perhaps he knows Dan Quinn during their time both in the college ranks. Quinn, of course, spent 2 years as a defensive line coach and defensive coordinator at Florida. Perhaps there's some familiarity there. Perhaps it's simply a system fit. Maybe he views what Steve Sarkisian does on offense in a similar vein to what Kyle Shanahan does on offense systematically, that you say to yourself, that's a little bit more of a seamless transition rather than rocking the boat and hiring someone like a Chip Kelly. But Steve Sarkisian, out of nowhere, seemingly.
Yeah, Sarkisian was probably at UW at a time, and Dan Quinn was coaching for Seattle Seahawks. Yep. I'm sure that there's been some communication there. I think that Pete Carroll's got a pretty deep he's got tentacles that reach pretty far, especially guys that have either coached at USC or coached at UW.
Yep.
And so Dan Quinn, obviously a disciple of Pete Carroll. So it wouldn't surprise me if the connection is somehow weaved through that.
Oh, okay, we're being told Adam Schefter's on the phone. Carrie, you speaking with Adam here?
Yeah, we're going to get Adam Schefter now. Adam, are you on the line, my friend?
I am here.
Okay, so I see that you have, and I'm on the Twitter, Alabama OC Steve Sarkisian is poised to replace Kyle Shanahan, and that is reported by Schultz Reports. What else can you tell me about this? How did this all come about?
Essentially, this is something where the Atlanta Falcons have been sifting through a lot of different offensive coordinator candidates.
Sure.
And I think they were determined to go outside the organization and get somebody that has some experience. And when they saw Steve Sarkisian, they recognized here's a guy who has worked in the NFL before. He was the Raiders quarterbacks coach in 2004 before bouncing around in college. We know his college background at USC and Washington and Alabama. But I think that the Falcons were looking for somebody with pro experience who understands the game, who could step in and replace the shoes that Kyle Shanahan vacated when he took the head coaching job with the 49ers. Somehow, somewhere along the way, they came to Steve Sarkisian. I know that the name Chip Kelly had come up. There were other names around the NFL that they also were looking at. And you could just tell in speaking to various Falcons officials that they were casting a wide net and looking over a slew of different candidates. And right now, this contract, as I understand it, is not fully done with Steve Sarkisian, but it's on the way to being done, and he's set and poised to become the Falcons' next offensive coordinator. I would think that that deal would get done fairly soon, but it looks like he's going to be the guy right now, barring something falling apart at the last minute. Of course, we know what happened this past year where Alabama hired him, and after Lane Kiffin's departure to become the head coach at Florida Atlantic, Sarkisian was promoted to the offensive coordinator position January 2nd. Well, he didn't hold that position very long before now going on to become the offensive coordinator with the Atlanta Falcons and moving on yet again.
Adam, a couple quick follows. Is there any type of relationship that you are aware of that Sarkisian has with Dan Quinn? Do you know anything about his relationship with the Falcons or anybody in the front office?
On the surface, I don't know of any, but usually in this particular case, there's always somebody who knows somebody, somebody who's worked with somebody. I don't know who that is just yet, but I guarantee you there's some sort of connection.
Okay, and then as far as him leaving, Sarkisian leaving Alabama, have they said anything? Have you heard anything from anyone at Alabama as to his whereabouts and him moving on?
Chris Mortensen would be the Alabama guy. I have not spoken to anybody at Alabama this morning and heard anything, but clearly they'll be in a situation where they're going to have to find a new offensive coordinator, assuming that Sarkisian does get this deal done with the Falcons, which sounds like it will happen. So Alabama will be looking for another offensive coordinator, but the Falcons won't, and that's the part that, again, we've been making calls about. They have been looking for somebody to replace Kyle Shanahan who could keep that offense humming at the same type of level, and it looks like it's going to be Steve Sarkisian.
All right, Sarkisian tentatively hired as the new OC in Atlanta for the Falcons. David, I'll send it back to you. That's breaking news.
Yeah, so Sark basically the OC at Alabama for one game, the national championship game, and a heartbreaking loss, and now he's going to another team that's dealing with a heartbreaking loss as he takes over the #1 offense in the NFL field. Your thoughts on what's just transpired?
So certainly, I think Adam did a good job of painting the picture that, usually when a coach moves on, we examine first the in-house options. Well, one of the issues with Atlanta is that Kyle Shanahan was a young coordinator. He's got a lot of young disciples underneath him. And there's the possibility that some Falcons assistant coaches could end up in San Francisco with Kyle Shanahan. So there wasn't a natural, obvious in-house replacement. And then when you play into the Super Bowl, as Tim and everybody knows, a lot of coaching hiring takes place during the Senior Bowl week when everybody converges in Mobile. All of a sudden, you have to explore outside of the, let's say, normal boundaries, but the normal sort of net that you are casting has to be expanded. And here we are with Steve Sarkisian.
Part of what happens is when you look at their staff in Atlanta, with Kyle moving on, there isn't anybody on the Atlanta offensive staff that's called plays in the NFL before. Right. There isn't one. And so I think a lot of people thought, well, hey, Raheem Morris has been a head coach before, and he's a wide receiver coach. It's not a good fit necessarily. Right. And so I think it's a good job of Dan Quinn and the front office of recognizing that and going outside. To Fields' point, because you go play in the postseason, you just take a look at somebody like Rick Dennison, who probably would have been available. Yep. Okay. Well, when the Denver staff, gets switched over after Gary Kubiak steps down, that'd actually be a kind of an obvious fit. Somebody that runs that Kubiak, Shanahan offense to maybe become the offensive coordinator in Atlanta. Well, he becomes an offensive coordinator somewhere else. He's no longer available for the Atlanta Falcons because of timing and the success that Atlanta had in the postseason. So now they find themselves in this situation where now you're probably looking at quarterback coaches around the league. Maybe it's somebody like Greg Knapp, to maybe coordinators at the college level or somewhere else. I think that's one of the reasons why we kept hearing Chip Kelly's name, was because here's a guy who's called plays in the NFL before and happens to be available.
Right. I was going to say, if you try to hire a quarterback coach from another team, they'd have to grant permission first, which a lot of teams are not willing to do at this juncture of the offseason.
You called it a curveball at the top of the segment. We're all sort of like knocked on our heels a little bit at this news. Sarkisian taking over as the Falcons' offensive coordinator.